Good morning. It's good to be with you at Prairie Street, even though it's in this odd way where I'm present to you, but you're not present to me. And I miss being able to see your faces and to talk to people again who I've come to very much appreciate. 2 years ago, I visited a friend in Seattle while traveling for work, and that summer forest fires were burning in British Columbia that caused the air to be polluted and dirty. You couldn't see the mountains across the bay, and we avoided being outside. He said it felt apocalyptic to him, the second year in a row with dirty skies. And now this summer is much worse, setting records for the fire season with large fires in California, Washington, and Oregon, and beyond. The Los Angeles Times analyzed decades of data on wildfires in California, as they saw how this year temperatures are hotter, fires are bigger, and the air quality is the worst in decades. And they concluded that record-breaking wildfires are occurring more often. 8 of the 10 largest fires in California history have burned in the past decade. On September 9, the massive August complex became the largest fire in the state's history, and that fire continues to burn. Those fires reveal to us the ongoing disruption and destruction caused by climate change. Drier and hotter air means more dead trees and vegetation to ignite. As we keep pouring more carbon into the air through burning fossil fuels, it only gets worse. While some attempt to blame fires on forest management, that's only part of the problem. Last year's fire season was also record-breaking in Australia, with every state having a major bushfire, as they call them. Forest fires, along with hurricanes on the East Coast, are among the most dramatic effects of climate change, but the deadliest natural disaster for humans in the U.S. are heat waves. More than 192 people died of heat-related causes in Phoenix in 2019, yet another record year. One story is that of Joey Azuela, who said he felt hot. He said it was a different kind of heat, a cooking hot. He was hiking with his father in a desert preserve in the city, and they had run out of water. As they approached the car, he collapsed onto the parking lot. By the time the ambulance arrived, the asphalt had singed his arms and legs, leaving second-degree burns. As his body temperature approached 108 degrees, his organs started to fail. He was put into a tub of ice. Doctors circulated his blood in and out of a machine to cool it, and he eventually recovered from heat stroke. His story does not end as tragically as it does for others. As with other disasters intensified by climate change, the most likely to suffer are the most vulnerable, the poor, the elderly, the sick. Phoenix Chief Sustainability Officer Mark Hartman calls it a silent storm. And why silent? Perhaps because heat waves and drought are not as dramatic as other extreme weather. They don't make compelling video. As they confront more days of extreme heat, Hartman is helping Phoenix become cooler by looking at how the city is designed. Most cities experience the urban heat island effect, where cities are hotter than the countryside around them. Their miles of asphalt and concrete in place of trees and vegetation are a major cause of this. So Phoenix plans to have 25% tree shade cover by the year 2030. Heat waves are perhaps the most obvious way people suffer because of the damage climate change is doing to God's creation. In our passage today, Jesus invites us to pay attention to God's creation. What do we discover from listening to God's other creatures? What do we learn from the birds of the air and the lilies of the field? Biblical scholar Richard Bauckham believes that when Jesus talks about God's care for the birds and lilies, he has Psalm 104 in mind. The psalm celebrates God's intimate and ongoing care for all creatures. God is not some clockmaker who designs and sets things in motion before retiring into the recesses of the cosmos. God extravagantly provides for a diversity of creatures. First and most basically, God provides the breath of life. We are reminded again that when people can't breathe, they don't live. God provides water. God gives food and provides a variety of habitats for the diversity of creatures. Among these are the trees necessary for the birds of the air to nest and thrive. And finally, God even gives joy. The psalm shows God and the creatures joyfully engaging one another. Birds sing for joy. God provides wine to gladden the human heart. And speaking of that, what is the place of humans in creation according to the psalm? We're mentioned more than any other creature, but not with a particularly exalted role. This psalm portrays us as fellow members of the community of creation, rather than the dominating species like in Genesis 1. Like other creatures, in this psalm we are dependent on the breath and spirit of God, which in the Hebrew of the psalm is the same word. Jesus emphasizes this common dependence in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6. We try to ignore our dependence on anything other than ourselves, and the novel coronavirus pandemic has fiercely confronted us with it. COVID-19 specifically targets our breath, the gift of God. And in the midst of police brutality, we are reminded of the vital importance of the words, "I can't breathe." What are we to learn from the birds? Birds have to work to find their food, but they don't store away for the future. Because we do, we are tempted to suppose that our provision depends on us. We may forget our dependence on God each day. Earlier in the sermon, Jesus teaches us to pray, "Give us today our daily bread." During this pandemic, we are learning the importance of taking one day at a time. Because God is generous in providing, Jesus says we don't need to be anxious about life and food and clothing. Some translations say, "Do not worry." Actually, the distinction between worry and anxiety is critical. Social scientists Anthony Leiserowitz and Nicholas Smith discovered that when contemplating global warming, fear and anxiety tend to make people defensive and less supportive of policies to address carbon emissions. But the emotion of worry can actually be productive. People who worry about climate change end up doing something about it. It motivates deeper thinking and creativity. So my goal now is to get my anxiety down to the level of worry. Less anxiety is what allows us to follow the focus of this passage in verse 33. Strive first for the community of God. And I no longer translate this as kingdom or reign because these words don't mean today what they meant earlier. I think we could also say neighborhood of God, or maybe even the economy of God. Wendell Berry was in fact inspired by Jesus' words to talk about the great economy. The economy much bigger than the gross domestic product or the stock market, the things that economists measure. All money made and spent is governed under something bigger, what we receive from our greater ecological world. All making of products is dependent on the original making of God. We only change and shape what is already there. The great economy is much bigger than our smaller human economy. And for too long, our small economy has ignored the great economy, the economy of God. The small economy helps people make a good living, which is great. But the small economy sets itself up as the great economy, demanding that we make it the first thing. We're told we can't address climate change because of the small economy, or that we can't address COVID-19. But the economy and ecology of God comes first. And COVID-19 taught us that we can make economic sacrifices because we value life. Following the better way of Jesus, where we trust in God's provision, we can more readily align our world with God's intentions. Climate change has been denied and politicized, disempowering us. Many of us simply don't want to think about it because it seems so complicated and difficult to do something. But when we strive first for the community of God, we discover how to address climate change with joy. We can break this down into what we might call 4 chunks. And the first chunk is household use, increasing the energy efficiency of our homes and buildings. While many upgrades cost more up front, almost all of them save money in the long term. The second chunk is food. Many contribute more carbon emissions through the meat we eat than through the car we drive. Though how meat is grown is critical. Eating locally, reducing food waste are also critical. The third chunk is transportation, buying smaller and more fuel-efficient cars, carpooling, taking public transit, even better, biking or walking. The fourth chunk is industry. This one is harder and more uncomfortable because it requires us to speak publicly about climate change. But this is the most important thing we can do in order to make a big and lasting difference because industry creates by far the most carbon emissions. We can buy renewable energy, promote it to our utilities. We can buy from companies that are most responsible about their energy use. We can boycott companies that are not. We can contact government officials to support measures to limit fossil fuel use. We can vote as if climate change matters. We can participate in strikes and public actions to encourage the needed change. If you're looking for something more practical, there is planting trees, which, again, offer habitat for the birds of the air. Your former transitional pastor, Steve Thomas, has begun a campaign at Mennonite Men called Join Trees, and their goal is to plant 1 million trees and protect 5,000 acres of forest by 2030. That protection is needed because many trees are still being destroyed by fires set both intentionally and unintentionally, by development and by harvesting. Responding appropriately to climate change gives us a chance to renew our desire to live more simply. We sometimes think that living simply means depriving ourselves, and it may involve sacrifice, but I believe that these things add a fullness and richness to our lives. My electric car is the funnest car I've ever driven. Walking with trees in our beautiful forests renews my soul during the pandemic. Consider the lilies of the field, Jesus says. King Solomon taxed and enslaved his people in order to produce glorious clothing for himself and his hundreds of wives, and yet Solomon in all his glory did not match the beauty of the lilies. The beauty of the lilies, the beauty of the simple things, the beauty and embrace of God's creation, the call to live simply, to honor God's creation, to strive for the neighborhood of God, is also a call to enjoy and to be the beautiful.